This is a special production of the People Power Podcast.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously.
Operation Safety Net was launched in February 2021 in preparation to the Derek Chauvin murder trial. It is a collaboration of statewide law enforcement agencies and the National Guard, created to prevent the type of uprising we saw last year after Chauvin murdered unarmed George Floyd. Operation Safety Net is hyper-focused on political extremists and outside agitators, they believed, who were intent on damaging property and causing destruction. According to its Twitter page, its mission is to preserve and protect lawful First Amendment nonviolent protests and demonstrations, prevent violent civil disturbances, assaultive actions, property damage, fires and looting to government buildings, businesses, and critical infrastructure. FBI Special Agent Michael Paul leveraged significant resources for this operation. Paul said the FBI's primary role is intelligence gathering. The FBI Fusion Center will assist Operation Safety Net in collecting this intelligence. On March 7th, Hennepin County Sheriff Dave Hutchinson said, sharing info will stop potential violence and destruction as the trial approaches. On March 29th, as the trial began, MPD Chief Arredondo thanked the protesters for remaining law-abiding, with no reports of arrests made or property damage. However, Operation Safety Net did not keep Daunte Wright safe. Everything changed on April 11th. The day before closing arguments in the trial began, Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter murdered Daunte Wright while he attempted to flee from a traffic stop. Activists on the ground do not believe Potter killed Wright on accident. Around midnight on April 12th, Operation Safety Net tweeted, "Sporadic looting and vandalism are being reported. Operation Safety Net teams are responding." Numerous people that night saw police riding around in unmarked cars in South Minneapolis doing anti-looting patrol. After Phase 3 of Operation Safety Net kicked in, Gretchen Brown from Rewire wrote about how emergency powers paved the way for police brutality at protests. Police have this incredible discretion and a lot of tools and a lot of manpower and weaponry to respond in a very aggressive way. When curfew hit at 8 p.m. on April 13th in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, it felt like someone had flipped a switch. Reporters on the ground say the protest outside the police department had been peaceful, full of speeches and songs, but the environment quickly changed as law enforcement began to use more aggressive tactics, firing less lethal rounds, tear gas and flash grenades at protesters in an attempt to disperse the protests. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz had earlier declared a peacetime emergency in 7 counties. He characterized his response in a press conference as the largest police presence in Minnesota history. It has been criticized by residents, though, who say it feels like a military occupation. Brooklyn Center residents living near the protest site were even gassed in their homes. It follows a familiar formula to many racial justice protests in recent history. A state of emergency is called, a curfew is instated, and the folks who continue to exercise their right to protest are met with violence and a large militarized police presence. We saw this during 2014 protests in Ferguson, Missouri, after the police killing of Michael Brown. We saw it in 2016 during protests at the site of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we saw it last summer in Minneapolis during protests after the police killing of George Floyd. An aggressive police presence doesn't have to start with a state of emergency and local curfew. Emergency powers don't on their own denote abuse. But the way they're enacted can vary drastically based on the assessment of the threat at hand. Often, emergency powers and curfews are enacted in a way that paves the way for, if not endorses, police brutality at protests. Studies tell us that police are more likely to view activists of color and left-leaning activists as being threatening and as being dangerous, said Karen Pete-Allure. Emergency powers are flexible to respond. When a state of emergency is in place, the enactor, whether that's the governor or mayor, becomes the commander-in-chief in a sense. They decide how to carry out the powers. Police have this incredible discretion and a lot of tools and a lot of manpower and weaponry to respond in a very aggressive way, Lure said. They are the ones that are providing the governor with information about what the threat is and whether a state of emergency is warranted, and how that state of emergency should proceed. Emergency powers have roots not in protest management, but for times like natural disasters and war. The emergency powers we're seeing enacted during these protests are the same ones we see in use during the COVID-19 pandemic, snowstorms, and floods. We've had emergency powers for as long as we've had constitutions. Constitutions are ways of dividing up political power on one hand and immunities against those powers on the other hand. But in an emergency, the day-to-day checks and balances that come with a constitution can slow down response and even further disaster. Emergency powers then provide built-in flexibility to respond however is necessary. And emergency powers allow the state to command our help. Fourth Amendment rights challenged. Emergency powers do not suspend the Constitution. While most state statutes don't have any sort of provision preserving individual rights during an emergency, we still have the same rights during a state of emergency that we do on a typical day. By the Fourth Amendment, we should still be protected against unreasonable search and seizure. Often lawsuits claiming police unlawfully arrested protesters are dismissed because of qualified immunity, which protects officers from lawsuits except in cases of incompetence. Officers are protected because they can say they suspected criminal activity. Basically, what the courts are doing is they're ignoring the fact that the underlying conduct the victim of the police violence is engaging in is expressive political activity, Lure said. The underlying conduct is not that they're criminal suspects. The underlying conduct is that they're actually protesters, which we are supposed to value as a society and also supposed to protect. Walz, the Minnesota governor, deployed 3,000 National Guard troops on the ground in the metro area as part of his public safety initiative, Operation Safety Net. That's in addition to 1,000 law enforcement officers and state patrol. And while curfews make it easier for police to arrest protesters, they already have arrest tactics at their disposal that allow them to arrest protesters for nonviolent conduct, including mass arrests for failure to disperse. Even journalists have been arrested simply for possessing gas masks to protect themselves from tear gas, according to Rewire. These arrests often aren't prosecuted, but they can be violent.
The fourth night was the night they stopped using tear gas. So the first 3 nights they used plenty of it. The first night was tons of tear gas. Second night was a lot. The third night was a lot as well, but they were done after that. It seems to be different policing as well. It seemed like the first night was Brooklyn Center police mostly. Each day was policed by different forces. And so the night that it was pepper spray only and like blasts of little pepper balls and little 40 millimeter marker rounds, that was the sheriffs. And that was the last night that they were shooting munitions, the sheriffs. Last night, they shot none that I saw.
There has been a concern over military use of force at protests since at least the Kent State Massacre in 1970, when soldiers shot and killed 4 students and wounded 9 during an anti-war protest. After the shootings, National Guard forces moved towards less lethal weapons, like rubber bullets, which are still in use today. But despite being labeled less lethal, rubber bullets can still seriously injure, even kill protesters, according to Rewires.
And so the first 3 nights was tear gas and everything but different people, right? I think it was Brooklyn Center, state troopers, and then Hennepin County. I think that might have been the list of how it went each day. Each police force, you saw different munitions and different tactics. So they've definitely been targeting press a lot. I was detained along with neighborhood reporters, as well as Extensive Knowledge Productions and Chris June. We were all detained in the same night. They broke my mic, neighborhood reporter's mic. They broke it in a whole bunch of pieces. They stole a lapel, the Unicorn Riot lapel from the mic, from the Unicorn Riot mic. And then also Extensive Knowledge Productions had his flexi cuffs put on so tight they tore his skin, so he's bleeding all over it. So these are all press documenting what the police are doing during their crackdown. Real quick to touch on too, with this interagency cooperation that they have and this unified command, they're skating any responsibility. So they just pass off responsibility if they do something wrong to somebody else. And that's been interesting to watch as well.
On April 15th, a few days after police murdered Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, community organizations and activists released this statement. Community organizations call on Walz, Fry, Carter, and Hutchinson to stop Operation Safety Net immediately. We are horrified by the state's preemptive force against its people and the compounding trauma caused by the state against Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Executive leaders are fully in charge of this force and have the power to stop this harmful approach. Our communities have the right to live and protest without being terrorized by a militarized police force. Journalists have the right to report what is happening without being harmed by police or arrests. We have already received reports from Brooklyn Center of youth sent to the ER after being struck by a tear gas canister. More than 100 people were seriously injured by police during the uprisings in Minneapolis last summer. Minnesota researchers made it clear in a medical journal report that less lethal force, including tear gas and rubber bullets, are not appropriate for crowd control. The report found 40% of people hit by rubber bullets sustain head injuries, including traumatic brain injuries and eye injuries. Other studies have shown tear gas can cause miscarriages and harm fetal development. Leaders in charge of MPD have not disciplined a single officer for misconduct. The health of our communities was at a breaking point before the death of Daunte Wright. The state's use of force against Minnesotans exercising their First Amendment rights in Brooklyn Center and militarization of our cities in response to police violence is wrong, traumatizing, and adding to the public health crisis of COVID, police brutality, and systemic racism. The continued use of militaristic tools of oppression to intimidate and halt peaceful, if justifiably angry, protest is another sign that Minnesota continues to prioritize white fears over Black lives. We call for immediate action by executive leaders to stop Operation Safety Net. Punishing people for grieving police violence with militarized force is not leadership, it is violence. For the health of our communities, we are pleading for a rational change of plans, transparency, and accountability.
Also, another side thing interesting to watch is who is the policing on the ground. So the large forces that you'll see with like the Minnesota lapels on their front of their vests, those are state troopers and conservation officers, and they've been working in tandem. And the conservation officers are DNR, Department of Natural Resources officers. So they've been now tasked with policing citizens throughout the metro area for the last year. And just to touch on that real quick, also, they've also been training with state troopers for many years now and how to quell Line 3 protests, Line 3 pipeline up north. And so they've been training for that. So it's really interesting to watch those guys come out in their training. And also those guys, the conservation officers, they just follow orders. And mostly, all those officers just follow orders. And so they don't know you, they don't care, and they just go after you. And that's the interesting thing also. When we were detained the other day, it was St. Louis Park, along with like other park, Brooklyn Park, and a few other officers that were sort of jumped off the bus to go running after people when I got detained. And so I just bring that up because all these different units, they're now working together under some unified command with no responsibility, and they don't care. That's like pulling people in from way out in the country, bringing them back in the state. It's like the police in general, right? Like you pull in people from Andover and Champlin, have them police the north side or the south side.
Try not to hurt them. If you do, I'll defend you in court. Don't worry about it. In the good old days, this doesn't happen because they used to treat them very, very rough. And when they protested once, they would not do it again so easily. We've become weak.
I think my message tonight is that as someone who's lived in Minnesota my whole life, and I represent the state patrol that represents the whole state, I think I'm extremely comfortable in saying and asking, we need help. We need help from Minnesotans to stand up and say that this can't be tolerated. It can't be tolerated. And I only say that because when I go out and I talk to people, that's what they tell me. And right now, to interrupt this cycle we're in, where every night we're out there in this fight, we need people to stand up and help us by saying it can't be tolerated any longer.
Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man.
People in power, they better watch out. Like, we're not gonna take this shit anymore. Yeah, we're ready.
Nothing is hidden, something changed, something different. No one is safe, the veil is lifted, but you saw through it because you are.
They're shooting families that are next to the police station with tear gas, or they have kids. They're arresting residents because they go outside and wonder why National Guard is on their lawn shining bright lights into their apartment buildings. It's wild, man. And again, it's all because the police killed somebody. It's not the community that just wants to go out here and do whatever they're doing. The police killed somebody, and the people are seeking some kind of recourse, some kind of justice.
Bullets, blades, blood and flames, naked rage and ancient pain.
And that's my ask, is that we get people to stand up and help us, because that's what we need in this moment. That's what the community needs. That's what the metro needs. That's what our state needs.
And you know what? The audience swung back. And I thought it was very, very appropriate. The audience hit back. And that's what we need a little bit more of now. Part of the problem and part of the reason it takes so long is nobody wants to hurt each other anymore, right?
Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man. Born to fight, born to win, embodiment of light in the form of man.
As you see them phase 3 throughout the city, they have quite the military presence as well, and so that hasn't deterred a lot of the protesters over the last 5 days. There's been maybe thousands every night in the street. Yeah, the first 4 nights, the police were really shooting a lot of munitions, ranging from chemical weapons, CS gas, HC gas, triple chasers, diversion device, flashbangs, inert blasts, inert grenades.
Bullets, blades, blood and flames, naked rage and ancient pain, broken dreams washed down the drain, a hope it seems has gone away. You got a purpose, you shine a light, provide a service with your willingness to fight.
Despite millions of dollars spent on protecting people and property for the Chauvin murder trial, Operation Safety Net failed to keep Ahmed Badal and Jaden Blackman safe. The family of Badal said Minneapolis police are covering up his murder and have refused to help his pregnant widow find answers.
People are seeking justice for Dante Wright, and it's this tragic, a tragic reminder that the police, if we can train them, they can be trainers. We can give them all the money that they want to get the best training, and we have the training officers that are pulling out their gun instead of a taser. Operation Safety Net, right? How many millions of dollars are they spending? How many, we're under military occupation now in our cities, and now you got kids, Minneapolis kids, they're going back to distance learning. Why? Because of the Chauvin trial. But I thought you had Operation Safety Net, right? So wait, who are you keeping safe?
Blood and flames, naked rage and ancient.
As a Northside resident, what is your feeling about Operation Safety Net and the military sort of occupying the city at this moment?
I think for some people, for most of us, the greatest tragedy that happened last summer was the murder of George Floyd. I think for other folks in leadership, I think the greatest tragedy that happened was that the 3rd Precinct burned down. And, while none of us want to see public buildings being burned to the ground, it is not the worst thing that happened. One of the worst things that happened was the police response to protests, which I believe inflamed protesters, inflamed activists, and really created a chaotic situation that was primed to turn out the way that it turned out. You got folks in the governor's office, you got folks in the mayor's office, and they think that the community is the problem. They think that the people out here are the problem. They think that it's just a bunch of rabid activists who with no impulse control. But, for those of us who are actually out there on the ground, we know what was happening. We saw the excessive tear gassing. We saw the rubber bullets. We saw the flashbang grenades, and we saw people getting injured. And we saw those methods have no effect on keeping us and our neighbors safe.